Well, hello, everybody. This is Daniel Paulus, and I'm glad to welcome you to the Invisible Obvious podcast. It's a place to explore the impact of actions or inactions that affect our daily lives. And as I talk about in my blog, I'm really interested in having these, what I call curiosity conversations about gaps and behaviors that seem obvious, but are clearly kind of invisible or just unimportant to other people. So today, I am delighted to welcome Scott Scherer as my first guest on this inaugural podcast. Scott, thank you so much for being with me today.
No, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So, first of all, I want to give you credit for nudging me in this direction to kind of hold up this larger conversation. And we'll
Mhm.
unpack this a little bit in our questions, but I thought it'd be easier just to kind of turn it over to you to start, to introduce yourself by
Mhm.
just telling us a little bit about kind of how you got to where you are in your professional life. And
No,
I know a lot about that myself. So there's one aspect of that you run a business and you've done coaching. So take it away, however you'd like.
okay, sure. So as you pose the question, I start thinking actually of the day that I graduated from Duke University, and it was a balmy, humid morning, and I was walking across the stage to get my diploma. And William Styron, the writer, had been our speaker, and so I was walking across the stage, and the ceremony was on the east lawn of Duke, which was just this huge yard with thousands of people in these chairs, and there was a big aisle right down the middle. And so I paused as I was walking across the stage, and I had my diploma, and I looked down this aisle, and I had this epiphany that was this. I said, I can look at my next 10 years as an opportunity to shop different life experiences. And then at the end of the 10 years, when I come to the end of that aisle, then I'll focus in on what I wanted to do. So somehow, by some grace, I was given permission to not be so goal oriented immediately. Like so many of my classmates had gone to med school, business school, law school, and that was great. But I just had this sense that I wanted to look around. So my first job I took was with United States Steel Corporation. I'd grown up in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh steel was king in Pittsburgh. So when I had a chance to get on an executive track position, I took it. And so I hadn't really done my research, so I was an econ major, but I didn't understand industries very well. And what I found out was the steel industry was tanking at that point because all the manufacturers in Japan were beating us up. And so here I had taken a job in a dying industry. So, and I also found out something that I was in the corporate world and I loved business, but I wasn't so much drawn to something as big as a corporation. So after about 2 years, U.S. Steel transferred me to St. Louis. And I just had one of those moments where I thought, I don't know where I belong, but I know I don't belong here. So then I started calling everybody I know and said, what do you think I should do? What do you think I should do? It's kind of frantic because they were pushing me to get an apartment and I kept putting them off. And I finally talked to a guy who I'd met when I was a senior at Duke. He was a priest, very entrepreneurial. And he said, why don't you come and use your business skills and help us raise money? And I thought, that sounds like a great idea. Can you pay my school loans? And he said, yeah. I said, can you make my car payment? He said, yeah. I said, you got me. Well, you have to feed me and give me a place to sleep too. And he said, okay, you're
Well,
in. Yeah.
that's a great negotiation skills right up front there.
Well, I was desperate too. And I was really
Yeah.
unhappy. So I remember calling my father and telling him, Dad, guess what? I'm quitting US Steel. And where are you going? I'm going to go volunteer. Volunteer? I said, yeah, I'm going to go volunteer for the Catholic Church. So this is the man who had moonlighted to pay for a Duke education, and now his son's going to work for free for 2 years. But it ended up really being a right turn to make because so I went to this. Now I'm in the nonprofit. So I went
Hmm.
from a corporation, and I didn't realize I was going to work for the largest organization on the planet, which is the Roman Catholic Church. And so I started doing fundraising, and one day my boss comes in and he says, "How would you like to organize a pilgrimage?" I said, great. What's that? I have no idea what a pilgrimage is. And he said, well,
Right.
if you get a group of people together and you travel to some sacred place and it's social and it's spiritual, and I'll show you how to do it. So we put one of these together. We took a group of 50 people to Europe. And I remember about three-quarters of the way through that, Dan, I was in the town of Assisi and I was at the end of the day and I was really, really tired. And I collapsed into my bed and I'm looking up at this wood beam ceiling in this hotel room. And I thought, I've never been so satisfied doing something in my whole life. And so I bookmarked that. There was something about this alchemy of pilgrimage and this experience. And that here it is, I had left this big corporate job, and now quietly, suddenly, I discovered something I really wanted to do. So when I finished up with this diocese doing all my volunteer work, I didn't know what to do. I had left the corporate track. What was I going to do? Who was going to hire me?
So how much time are we talking about here between leaving U.S. Steel, going to work for the diocese,
So
and how much time?
so that was in my early 20s. So I spent 2.5 years with U.S. Steel, and then I spent like 3 years with the diocese, 2.5, 3 years. And then I thought, okay,
Okay.
well, I want to do this pilgrimage thing. So now I'm in my mid 20s. All of my friends are graduating from law school, business school. They're doing their med school residencies. And here I am, um, not making any money, but being very happy. And
Right.
so I started organizing these trips. I hung my shingle and I said, okay, now I'm a pilgrimage guy. So I started going around to churches and asking them, you need somebody to organize your trip. And so I started to grow this little business. It was only like my little lemonade stand of a business, but I started to grow
Right.
and started to do more trips for more people. And I started to like it. And then what I would do is I would take a group on a trip and then I would send them back and I would spend 2 weeks traveling around Europe doing the research for my next trip. And so I did that really into my early 30s, and the business grew, but I couldn't, it was just, I was a sole proprietor and I didn't have anybody working for me. And then the Gulf War hit, flat, business gone, nothing. Okay. Zero.
Right. This was
Now
when? No, not,
I'm
not
31 years old, 91, 1990.
okay.
Okay.
When went to yeah, yeah.
Yeah, 90, 90, 91, 90, that in the early 90s. So just by serendipity, I got introduced to two guys who were on the West Coast, and they were senior in the travel business. And they wanted to start, of all things, imagine a Catholic pilgrimage company. What are the
So they
chances?
wanted to start it. It wasn't. It didn't already exist.
Didn't already
They.
exist. So here I was this little
Okay.
mom and pop shop on the East Coast, and these two guys on the West Coast, and they were senior in the travel industry, and they had both retired from their positions, and they had some money, and they wanted to start a business, but they were the equity. They were looking for the sweat. That was me. Okay.
I get it. Yeah.
So let's bring this kid out from the East Coast and we'll put the money in the business and let's see where it goes. So we started this business together. I loaded up my U-Haul, drove cross country, and then I landed in Southern California and we started the business. Catholic Travel Center is the name of the company. And then we kept it together for 5 years and I bought them out after 5 years. And then that was 1996. And so I've had the business on my own since then. And we have a team of people. We've been working in this niche market. We're in the travel industry. It's a niche market, and we service the Catholic institutions, and we organize customized group travel for them. And so that's how I got into the travel business. And then after being here maybe 10 years, I found out that there was a grad school out here. I wanted to further my business education so I could get better at managing this company. And I learned that Peter Drucker, who's the father of modern management, he had a business school, actually not a business school, it's a school of management in Southern California.
Mhm.
And so I went down there, checked it out. Drucker was not teaching at the time. He was already emeritus at that point, but he was still around the school and giving guest lectures. And so for those of you who don't know Drucker, Drucker is considered to be the father of modern management. And his texts are seminal texts in every school of management around the globe.
And
And,
and you've
and
introduced him to me. Yeah, I'm starting to dig in more because his discoveries, he was kind of prophetic, I think, and like a Marshall McLuhan about media, right?
yes,
Even back how many years ago,
yeah.
he was asking that hard question, like what's not working here, right? And how do
Mhm.
we unpack this and get into the interpersonal part of this and not just the widgets and the nuts and the bolts that are certainly part of any business, but
Right.
are only one layer of it.
Yeah, Drucker called himself a social ecologist. Interesting. And so
Okay.
he had an appreciation for how important society was. So he left Germany, Austria right as Hitler was coming into power. And he saw that things weren't
Mm,
working. So one of his motivations really was how do we prevent societies from getting to where Germany had gotten to? And one of his conclusions was healthy institutions. and how do you create healthy institutions, one of the ways was through good management. So that was his deeper motivation.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's fascinating. We could talk about Drucker for hours, which we
Yeah.
will talk about together
Good.
after this. But it leads me to my next question, which is really the two things I'm trying to unpack with people and the work that I'd like to do with people
Yeah.
in my coaching business are around integration and accountability, right? So
Mm-hmm.
you've been a coach as well
Mm-hmm.
out of this training, and I'm curious, what does integration mean to you? How have you approached it in a professional setting? Because there's certainly a layer of integration in a personal therapeutic setting, right? But I
Right,
think I'm
right.
trying to get at what does it look like, and what was Drucker pointing to?
So, so I would say I'm in terms of Drucker specifically. I don't know what he would say about integration, but my approach when you ask integration, my first thought is, okay, this integration is the coming apart when things come apart. So
Right.
integration is making things whole and making a whole. And so I think of Drucker's perspective, which placed like Drucker started at the macro level. So he started with what makes a healthy society. Got it? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So what makes for a healthy society? So and so management is a form of integration of a lot of different roles into serving a larger whole. You can think of management that way. So and it's an orchestration and a bringing together of different competencies to serve something larger, something bigger than ourselves. And so I would say that management as a discipline is a way of integrating the competencies and the commitments of a group of people to serve some agreed upon goal. Yeah.
And that reminds me of something that I'm also very curious about and have learned a
Yeah.
great deal about is kind of servant leadership, right?
Mhm.
How are we approaching this to help the whole enterprise and system feel integrated so everyone knows their role and
Yeah.
feels like they're a part of a community that's creating something for someone else, not just what they can get out of it, right?
Right, right. Yeah. So I mean, it's one of the great things about our country is also, you know, we have a great emphasis on the individual role and individual responsibility. Sometimes that can lead us to be weighted toward looking at the individual and not looking at the connections between the individuals, and that gets at your invisible obvious, right? It's the interactions and the coming together of these personalities with their histories and their competencies to create something. But you can't see that interactivity, but it's there, right? And all you see is the people on the nodes, right? The two that are interact. But what's the interaction, and how do you bring together the aspirations and the competencies of these people, which are not necessarily always visible?
Yeah, and you've been great about encouraging me to think about this through the lens of my previous life, which is in the arts and theater in particular, where
Yeah.
we get into a rehearsal room and it's all about figuring that puzzle out, basically, right? We've got a script, we've got a director, we're all coming to it with our different roles, but we're trying to integrate all those things so that what we come away with is a holistic product, you want to call it that, or a holistic experience, so that the audience hopefully feels it's very organic to them, but also senses, this communal expression, for lack of a
Hmm.
better phrase.
Yeah. And
And
also, as go ahead.
well, I think you pointed this out to me. I think I take that for granted sometimes that other people think that way or operate that way in a professional setting when my experience in non kind of artistic organizations has been very linear and siloed for the most part. And it's very difficult for people to figure out a way to collaborate without ego, without agenda
Mm-hmm.
for the greater goal of the organization. Obviously, we're all getting paid to help the organization be profitable, but also I'm always the audience advocate guy of like, well, if we're not really serving our audience with what we're doing and why we're doing it, then it's going to be harder to be more profitable at a certain point because we're trying to shove something to them they may not be interested in. So,
Yes. And also, I mean, I think you said something that's key there, which is that you coming out of a theater background, a theatrical presentation is explicitly collaborative. It's obvious
right,
that these roles need to be integrated. And when we grew
right,
up when you come out of an industrial model, which is more kind of parts, and they're assembled, but they're not necessarily integrated and interrelated, that and there's a lot of ways. I think there's a writer, her name is Meg Wheatley, and she was the one whose writing first introduced me to the contrast between what she calls a mechanical worldview, which is parts, and a biological
mhm,
world, and that we need to bring the biological worldview into the management world, which is about an organ, because an organization is made up of organisms, and that's the root of the word organization is organisms. And so when you
right.
think of cells rather than parts, and cells interrelate in a way that's different than parts. And so that kind of thinking is, I think, important to what you're talking about, this integration. So we can see what the biases are of this mechanical worldview.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me like we're all trying to be Henry Ford and create an assembly line, which is really not. I mean, it worked in the time of, it worked very well, but we through technology and through interpersonal communication, we have just evolved so much from that.
Mhm.
And now, especially in this day and age, we have people. The conversation has become very much about how to integrate identity and diversity and equity and all of those things. And so it's hugely complex. Um, but it's interesting work if you're willing to go deeper. It's just messy, right? It's not very
Mhm.
linear, and so I understand when managers don't necessarily have the time or feel they need to make the time to do that messy work. But I would advocate that to get better employees, more satisfied employees, better retention, better productivity, that's where you need to go because otherwise we're treating people like widgets and they'll do a job for a certain amount of time to a certain degree, but they will start looking elsewhere if they feel that way for too long. I mean, would you agree with
I,
that
I
assumption
would
or?
agree. And I would say, too, that a lot of the management thinking that we've had was around the widget world, the parts world, the manufacturing model, or the material model. And so now we're asking managers who are the world has quickly shifted, but we haven't brought managers up with these competencies to have these more relational uh, and let's say biological view of things, relational, and that it's it's the kind of thing where you have to have done some work, inner work yourself. I would say, I would argue, so if and so we have managers and leaders who are in positions who haven't done their own personal inner work that's going to give them the competencies to be effective in this new world that they're being asked to manage and lead it.
Yeah, that's very well said, Scott. I couldn't agree more.
Mm.
Um, it's fascinating to work with different folks in leadership roles and to see or observe how much of that work they may have done or not done. And you don't
Hmm.
always know, but there are symptoms of that that seem to
Yes.
trickle out that I've seen be consistent throughout my professional career in different settings. Um, so that kind of brings me to my next question, which is how is accountability related to all of that? Because man, that seems to be a super challenge, especially in the current climate where we've got different generations working together with different work styles and we have different cultures. I mean, even, I bring a Midwestern work ethic. I know that. I grew up in a family business. So it just makes sense to me to put in an extra effort if I really feel it's going to move the dial. But I just have found that accountability is super challenging for people to wrap their arms around. And I don't know, maybe you can talk about that as a business owner and how you've done that, with your team.
So I would say one of the things that's helped me most around accountability is working with, I learned this from a buddy of mine who has a business. His name is Todd Lapidus, and he does a lot of work in the hospitality sector around standards. And so he helps
Hmm.
hotels, large hotel chains, and large organizations within the travel world establish standards, because if we're going to have accountability, we have to start with what our standards are so that we can then hold people accountable to standards that have been established. Unfortunately, standards, it's, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so I've worked in settings where there's been a lot of work done by outside consultants that come in and build like values, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got these values set and they're articulated in a document, and everybody buys into them initially. And even if leadership reminds people of them, the accountability still seems not necessarily connected to them,
Well,
right?
and
And I don't know if
frequently,
I'm
well, and anything that's going to be managed is going to need systems and structures to manage it. So just
right.
having the values written down, that's not enough. There need to be systems in place and structures in place that support the living out of those values, and then also have a feedback loop on when those standards are not being met. And this is, I think, the blind spot of a lot of people, because I think a lot of folks in management don't understand this kind of how this kind of micromanagement needs to be done in order to be effective. And so that means setting up not just meetings, but it's setting up ways that people can be measured against and evaluated against meeting a standard that's been set. And so that needs to be visual, and it needs to be made aware to them, and then they need to be held accountable if they're not meeting standards that they've committed to meet. So I think it
Yep.
traces back to the standards, and then it needs systems and structures to enforce those standards. And I think, to your point, that's frequently what's missing. Everybody gets the consultants that come in. Okay, here's our value statement, here's our mission statement, and then that gets folded, put it in a drawer, and everybody goes about their work.
Yeah, or it gets farmed out to the HR team to try to implement,
Hmm.
which they do the best job they can, but they're not managing the people on a daily basis. So
Hmm.
it's like this system that frames the context and then turns it all over for a year and then brings in some type of application to test what's happened.
Hmm.
And again, this is an imperfect science. It's really more of an art, I think, but
Hmm.
it's just been fascinating. I mean, I've gone through several different evaluation, programs that different companies have, and they've certainly done hard work to develop those, but I still don't feel like maybe the honest conversations are happening, because my feeling as a manager has been, if I'm not having those conversations about your accountability on a regular basis, and I'm waiting to your evaluation to have that, I'm not doing my job as a
No,
manager,
you're not.
right?
Yeah, and you hit one of the nails on the head there, and that's the hard conversations, because people don't want to have them. That's why they're called hard.
Yeah, yeah.
That's why they're called hard.
Well, we're
Yeah.
going to have another session on just that alone, because that's I'm fascinated by it. Like I said, and I don't know if I just have a higher um, appetite for risk because of all the crazy things I've done in my professional career, or
You
I
might.
just
Yeah.
value authenticity so much, that I just want to get at those harder questions, because once you move through them, I think you're in a much different place. Um, Different place as a manager, different place as an employee, different place as an organization. And it's not a one-off, it's not a magical, test or evaluation or just a personality test and then trying to track to that or even match other personalities. It's a lot more than that. Um, so, all right, we could talk and talk about this. I'm going to move us on into like a favorite story or metaphor that kind of speaks to your life journey, because I know you like metaphors. You've encouraged me to use them in the work and you kind of told it in the beginning too about how you discovered that the steel business was not for you. Maybe you want to share that story about the gentleman that sat you down in his office, the older gentleman, and said, "This is how this business works. What do you really want to do?" If you recall that, just briefly. So,
So I'm thinking, in terms of a metaphor, one of the metaphors that comes from me is, I would say, in all the work that I've done, is I feel like I'm a midwife for people's transformative experiences. And so
and I've seen that firsthand. Yeah, yeah.
that got exercised in the coaching world. And then also when I was working for the church, I was doing retreats. And then the travel experiences that we put together for people are very transformative. So for me, it's easier to have these kind of in-depth conversations around the inner world of people and these kind of subjects that might be deeper to people because I've always been drawn to that, the inside
Right.
of life. So I'm naturally introverted and very reflective, and I spend a lot of time reading and reflecting on things. So, and I came up with this metaphor when one of my coaching clients asked me what my metaphor would be for my life, just like you have,
Oh, okay.
because I was working with her and we were coming up with different metaphors for where she was and where she wanted to get to, and this was probably 20 years ago, and I've stuck with that, and it's a lens that's helpful to me. And even in the writing that I'm doing, so I'm doing some writing now. I'm writing the children's story, and I'm writing some essays, and even in that, I see that there's this reflex to be a midwife to help people give birth to something that's not there yet that wants to come forward.
Well, appreciate that. You've been that as a mentor and a friend to me in my life, and we've shared the kind of special experiences we've had in Israel and the Holy Land, and talking
Mhm.
about wanting to be in a more generative environment where it helps myself grow, but also everyone around me. And again, that's easier said than done, depending on the circumstances. But
Mhm.
um, great. I think that's a great way to kind of answer that question.
Okay.
Last two things quickly. I want to, are not meant to be trick questions. I'm feeling like James Lipton a little bit here on
Okay.
inside the actor studio. But so where do you feel the most vulnerable, Scott, either in your professional or your personal life, and what are you the most hopeful about? Because we are living in a challenging time, what we talk about all the time, on multiple levels in society. But vulnerability, because I want to crack that open. I think you kind of intimated it in the work that you do. People are more open and vulnerable about the experience they're having. But for you at your age, where what you want to do next, whatever that may be, where do you feel like you have a softness you still want to work on?
There's a couple areas. So one of the things that comes to mind when you bring up vulnerability, and this has come on for me even, I would say, more in the last months, I would call it environmental vulnerability. And
Hmm.
it's a it's a vulnerability I feel as a person on this planet when I see what's happening in terms of heat and storms and how the planet's changing, the oceans are changing, and there's a vulnerability there that I feel it's coming closer to the surface because it's something that I don't have any control over, and it's something that's impacting me and every denizen of this planet. And so I feel I do feel that vulnerability of what are we going to do? What can I do? And what responses can I make? And I find myself taking shorter showers and being much more conservative around water, and that's
Yep.
my small way that I can contribute. I would also say that I feel vulnerable when I write and I present. So I'm trying to get I'm doing some writing and trying to get some things published and working with editors. And there's something about a creation. So writing is an artistic creation of sorts. It's creating with words. And there's always the artist's vulnerability of creating something and putting it out there, because of all your theater background. There's a
Yep.
vulnerability, and
Well,
there's something that compels us to create, and there's also a vulnerability in that act of creation, and they're both there. It's both and it's living in that tension of feeling like I have the thing that I have to say or do, and at the same time I feel exposed by it and I feel vulnerable, to use your word.
yeah, I totally agree. I mean, and that's what people ask me, do I miss being in the theater? I miss being in the rehearsal room.
Mm-hmm.
I miss the creative process and the
Yes.
vulnerability that goes along with that. What can I bring to it? What can you bring to it? What are we creating together? How are we going to ask some questions of, is that, the most vulnerable we can be for the audience? Because that's really our job, in that regard. So
And
appreciate that. And then
yeah. So
What, what are you hopeful?
one other thing that comes to mind when you say vulnerability is that my experience is like you were talking about difficult conversations, hard conversations. There's a vulnerability that those require. There's also a ripeness that sits right in the middle of vulnerability. That something is fertile, but it comes at a price of our own facing into and being with our own sense of vulnerability.
Hmm.
Yeah,
I like that a lot. All right,
yeah.
what are you hopeful about? That this one we kick around on a weekly basis as we talk through the headlines, right? I'm curious how you answer this one.
Mm. So the first thought that comes to mind is I think of my nieces and nephews, and they're not aware or so aware of all. They're somewhat aware. The ones who are in their teens aren't of the challenges that our world is facing, and so there's and even those who are somewhat aware of it, they're not being brought down by it, and so their spirit, and partly it's maybe it's you can say it's ignorance, but there's more than that. There's this spring inside of them that is full of possibility. And so I find just being around youthful folks and my nieces and nephews and kids of friends, that's really, that really gives me hope. And I have an implicit trust I still have an implicit trust in humanity. I mean, I know that these are really bifurcated times and we see it all around the world where we have really factions and sides and tribalism. And so, but I trust that this is a phase that we're going through and that there is something else better for us on the other side of that.
Well, I think that speaks to you being able to have a long view as a man of faith in
Mm,
some regard, right? That there's always hope,
mm,
despite how
mhm,
dark it may get. And
mm.
we've lived through darker times before we were even on this earth.
Yeah,
And hopefully this will follow through. But Scott, this has been a great conversation. It's been a great fun for me to kind of just talk with you and explore some of these things. And we'll see how this all turned out from a production perspective, but I so appreciate you making the time for me today. And again, I want to thank you for encouraging me to explore this area for my own professional development and work. And I hope that I can get others to want to have these kind of conversations with me. So thank you, my friend.
thank you. Anytime.